wind up our 4 sessions, it's been a terrific series. I've certainly gotten a lot out of it, and I think our speaker today will add to the value of everything we've heard so far. Dr. Ann Speckhard. She is an assistant associate professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University Medical School, and she's been worked in the field of post-traumatic stress disorder. She's been on a number of committees and investigations, chair of the NATO Human Factors in Medicine Research, technology experts on the psychosocial, cultural, and organizational aspects of terrorism, member of the UN roster of experts for terrorism. She has provided expert consultation to European governments, U.S. Department of Defense. In 2002, she interviewed hostages from the Moscow Dubrovka Theater incident, and she also interviewed surviving hostages from the Beslan school takeover. I think that has impressed me as much as anything in looking over her background was just the sheer numbers of interviews she has done of terrorists, others suspected of terrorism. She's collected more than 400 research interviews of family members, friends, close associates, and hostages of terrorists in practically every country you can think of where there have been major terrorist incidents. Director of the Holocaust Survivors Oral Histories Project for Belarus, and she researched traumatic stress issues in survivors of the Chernobyl disaster and worked with American expatriates after 9/11, and is the author of several books, Talking to Terrorists, Warrior Princess, and Fetal Abduction. The Talking to Terrorists is one that we have here and will be available for signing after her presentation. So we're delighted to have you here. Please help me welcome Dr. Ann Speckhard.
Thank you, Peter. Glad to see you all made it. Excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, but do you know where your wife is? It was 7 a.m., and my husband of 24 years, Daniel Speckhard, a diplomat posted to NATO's international staff in Belgium, was standing at the door of our home in Brussels, barely awake. One of the plainclothes agents handed him an FBI calling card. Daniel rubbed his eyes and asked, "Excuse me, what?" "We're sorry, Ambassador Speckhard, to disturb you like this, but your wife has been running around in Gaza meeting with terrorists. Is she pulling a Patty Hearst or something?" My husband, now wide awake, said, "No, wait a minute." He invited them to come in and take a seat while he ran up to my office and returned with papers in hand. My wife is a university professor, a psychologist. She's an expert on terrorism. She studies this type of thing, does interviews. Here's her latest paper and her business card, he said, handing them a thick document. "She's a professor?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Well, sir, we received a very angry call from the Israelis last night accusing us of running an undisclosed CIA agent in Gaza. They thought your wife was undercover." At this, Daniel laughed. "She's got nothing to do with the CIA, at least that I know of." "Okay, sorry for disturbing you, but could you please ask her to come in and talk to us when she gets back? It might be a good idea to discuss security issues with her, how to stay safe." He nodded. Yes, he thought, that would be a good idea. So as Peter told you, I'm a research psychologist in the psychiatry department of the Georgetown University Medical School. And what I read to you just now is from the introduction of my book, Talking to Terrorists. And I sometimes joke with my friends in the Navy SEALs that they can use it as a weapon because it is big and heavy. My research is based upon a decade of interviews with over 400 actual terrorists, terrorist leaders, terrorist cadres, interviews of failed bombers that are in prison, and in the case of suicide bombers who are already dead, interviews with their family members and close associates, as well as secondary interviews that I collected, as Peter told you, with the hostages in Moscow, where 800 hostages were held in a theater by Chechen terrorists for 3 days, and the Beslan school hostage taking, where 1,300 women and children were held for 3 days. These were events in which the hostages sat beside the suicide terrorists in their activated states and had conversations with them about why they were there, if their bombs were real, which they were, if they would really explode them, including the bombs that the women had strapped to their bodies. And no one has ever had a chance or had the courage or the stupidity to interview a suicide terrorist in an activated state. So when I found out, I actually went to interview the hostages the first time with the intent simply to help them. I hadn't even thought about that they had these secondary interviews. But on our first interview with the first hostage, when they told me about conversations, I mean, just imagine you're sitting next to each other and you're asking the person next to you who has a bomb belt on and at any moment can explode it. Why are you here? Are you really serious about this? Would you really do it? And so that was quite amazing. So as you can see, I had many opportunities and many places. My interviews over this 10-year period took place in prison cells, on the streets, inside slums, and in homes. And when I was in the West Bank in Palestine, because of the checkpoints, I found that I couldn't return back to my home base. So I was offered early in the morning after I'd completed 1 or 2 interviews, if you would like to continue your interviews, this family that you just interviewed, who has a family member that's a terrorist, has invited you that you can stay here and continue your interviews all afternoon or else we have to go. So I took terrorists up on their offer of hospitality and even stayed in their homes. And that was also quite amazing to get a chance to observe them in their family context and, not just in a 1 or 2 hour interview, but through an entire evening and the next day. And I have to say they were surprisingly like you and I, hospitable, good food, made sure I was comfortable, and all of those sorts of things. My primary research question in going down dark alleyways, into prisons, there's a coffee. Thank you, Amanda. I was in my car for a really long time this morning. I don't know if I'm going to drink that while I'm talking, but just the thought that it's there. But anyway, my primary research question in going down dark alleyways, into prisons, ghettos, safe houses, etc., to sit with terrorists was always, what factors came together to put individuals on the terrorist trajectory? Is there anything that could have prevented that? And what might take them back off the terrorist trajectory? Keep in mind, I'm a psychologist, so I'm always thinking, how do we define the problem, but also, could we treat this problem? My interviews took place in Israel, in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza, in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Morocco, Russia, Belarus, Chechnya, and also in Western Europe, in Belgium, the Netherlands, UK, and France. My focus was mainly on militant jihadi terrorism, but my subjects came from both militant jihadi and Marxist ideologies. The interviews were exploratory, and they were oriented towards an in-depth psychological analysis of the person. I really, literally wanted to learn what makes a terrorist tick. I wanted to understand their motivations for joining a terrorist group and engaging in terrorist violence. I had with me a set of questions, but keep in mind I was talking to terrorists, so some of them had guns on their laps while I interviewed them. So I didn't always have the choice to impose my order, and I had to listen to them go on about their propaganda or whatever their sets of beliefs were, their angry issues, and I allowed them to do that, or I shouldn't even say I allowed them, I was subjected to it. And then I just waited, and I waited until they hit upon something personal or vulnerable, and I seized upon the opportunity and tried to expand that and then go into my set of questions. But because of that, the interviews meandered in various ways, but I found that that was actually useful because sometimes they mentioned things that I would have never thought to ask about. And it taught me for my next interview to include a few more questions about those sort of things. My sample was snowball, meaning that I started from the outsides and worked my way in. I had to gain trust to get direct interviews with terrorists or their family members or their close associates. And I worked in foreign countries where I didn't know the language. I speak Russian pretty well, so I could receive the interviews in Russian. I didn't ask my questions, particularly in Beslan in Russian, because I wanted to make sure that they were really carefully phrased, because I was dealing with people that had lost their children and their loved ones, and it was horrific. When I went home from those interviews, I went back to the hotel and wept every night. It was horrible. But I used translators and guides in every other situation, and even then I used translator to form my questions. So I was reliant on their language skills and their cultural knowledge. But I made enough interviews that when I was consistently hearing the same things, I could tell if something was a bit off. And but it wasn't direct that I spoke their language. As I went about conducting these hundreds of interviews, I came to the attention of many governments, actually, and I think from time to time I was followed. And in Israel, I had my computer taken away from me, and I'm told it has a Trojan horse and it transfers from computer to computer, so I'm in direct contact with Israel, I guess, but since they're an ally country, I don't worry about that too much. I also came to the attention of the U.S. Department of Defense and the UK Home Office, and I consulted with both of them on how to do prevention and also how to rehabilitate terrorists. In the case of DOD, I was invited in 2005 to work in 2006, 2007, going in and out of Iraq to put the detainee, what became named as the Detainee Rehabilitation Program together. On its psychological and Islamic sides, and to pilot test it. It originally was called a de-radicalization program, and in the UK I consulted with, and I can't remember in Iraq if I said they had 20,000 detainees, 800 juveniles. In the UK I was living in Belgium, so I went frequently to London and consulted with the Home Office on things that they were doing in the streets and through small NGOs, and looking at maybe some of the best ways to try to intervene to prevent and to rehabilitate terrorists. So today I have a short time, and you saw I have a long book, so you can always read the book later, but I will try to share with you what I know, what I learned from a decade of interviews. And what I hope to convey is that there are 4 essential ingredients that go into the lethal cocktail of terrorism. I saw these in every setting. How terrorists operate on each of these 4 levels to put individuals on a terrorist trajectory and what might take them back off of it. And now is probably a good time to let you know my definition of terrorism. There's over 800 definitions of terrorism. I don't know if anybody's told you that in our speakers yet. I tried to go to all the previous speakers, and they were great, by the way, and it's a good program. But when I'm referring to terrorists, I'm talking about non-state actors, individuals and groups who primarily, but not necessarily exclusively, target innocent civilians and civilian properties to cause harm, and who via media amplification create terror in a much larger witnessing audience for the purpose of moving a political process in the direction that they wish to push it. So when we get to the Q&A, let's not argue about terrorism. That's my definition, and it relies on State Department, FBI, and some of the other definitions, and each one of them has its own nuance. But so we're not talking about freedom fighters. We're talking about people that target civilians. My assumption going into my research is that no one is born a terrorist. It's in fact why I put on the cover of my book, and I probably should have brought a slide of this since you can't see, but my book's in the back too. It's a picture of a little girl. She's 4 years old. I met her in Nablus. We had arrived in Tel Aviv, and a suicide bomber had attacked that morning. And when we arrived, it was already over. 40 people were wounded, 3 were dead. And we went over to the West Bank and we were making interviews. And when we were in Bet Farik, we were invited to go over to Nablus and go into a safe house and meet the senders of this person who had just attacked. And that was pretty scary. And we were sitting in the safe house waiting for them to arrive and interviewing the people that operated the safe house. And this little girl, I don't know if you can see her, probably not, but she's just 4 years old. She's really cute. Some people have asked me, is that a picture of you on the book? And she's got curly hair. And she came out with a little black pistol and aimed it at me. And of course, I was a little bit surprised and asked, is that a gun? And they said, no, it's a toy. And you couldn't tell, it looked like a real gun. And they said, she's afraid that you're an Israeli and you've come to interrogate her mother, and she went to get a gun. So I said, can I take a picture of her? And she was pointing it at me. And, well, she was pointing it at me like this. And I said, can I take a picture? They said, sure. I took it. And then suddenly the guide intervened and said, no, no, don't use that picture. And she instructed the little girl of, this is how you hold a pistol. And so I have this picture, the second picture, of this 4-year-old girl holding a pistol correctly. And for me, we had been with that guide earlier in the day, and she'd done other things like that with children. It was just so chilling, this lovely, lovely child, with a smile on her face at that point, because she wasn't scared anymore. Everybody had reassured her that I wasn't coming to arrest her mom, and that I wasn't Israeli. But already knowing how to hold a pistol. So let's see. So she had an already formed belief that when your family is under threat, the appropriate response is to go and get a weapon. And we may want to note, since you've all been in on this series, that Dr. Samanow referred to that as a thought error in the criminal mind. In this case, it's a learned response from cultural training and living among militants in an active conflict zone. So I don't know if I would label her as having a criminal mind or the beginnings of a criminal mind, but you do see she's, taking teeny tiny 4-year-old steps onto the terrorist trajectory. Let's see. So for me, the picture on the front of my book of a child knowing how to hold a gun properly and pointing it out at us, at the readers, tells half the story already. Terrorists are made, not born. And as I told you, there's 4 essential ingredients to making a terrorist. Those 4 ingredients are a group, an ideology, social support for terrorism, and individual motivations that motivate individuals to join a group and to take part in terrorist violence. So let's start with the group. With terrorists, there's nearly always a group, and the group has a political goal. That's by definition, because terrorism is a political activity. And for that political goal, to achieve it, they're willing to use terrorism. Likewise, the terrorist group represents in reality or in their imaginations a larger constituent group that wants something. They want to end an occupation, they want to win back territory, they want to gain independence, gain power, resources, you name it. And the group is potentially playing to 6 audiences. They're definitely playing to their actual target. They're killing or harming people. Then they're relying upon media amplification. So whoever they kill, maybe it's 6 people, maybe it's 100 people. Usually it's very small numbers. It goes out to millions, even billions. And so entire populations suddenly become traumatized and concerned about a political issue that they might not have known about earlier. And, think about what's happened with the Olympics. We all heard about terrorism. We all heard, I think you did, about the Caucasus Emirates. I know my phone was ringing off the hook giving interviews on it. About the Caucasus Emirates, probably nobody ever heard of Doku Umarov before, but suddenly the Chechens, to the terrorism in that part of the world, was on the media simply because they made the threat to blow up and bring suicide terrorists to the event. So they didn't even have to carry out their action, and they got their media amplification. They're also playing to sympathizers and constituents, and in that case, Umarov is playing to a wider audience. He's claiming that the Circassians are part of the people that he represents. Up till now, he never did, but he claims that. He's playing to outside funders. We saw in the Moscow Nordost hostage-taking, they had huge banners up in the theater that were written in Arabic. Chechens speak Chechen, and if they wanted to communicate with the Russians, they would have written in Cyrillic, but their banner was in Arabic. Why is that? Because they're playing to potential funders. Look what we did and look at our messages. And also, claiming this wider Islamic militant jihadi ideology. There may also be outbidding among groups. We saw that a lot among Palestinians, that a group that maybe wasn't engaging in suicide terrorism like the PFLP, I spoke to Ahmed Sadat in prison twice and asked him why his group decided to engage in suicide terrorism and how he felt about it, and he told me he really didn't like it, but that the other groups were doing it, and to keep their constituents and to, basically be able to offer a similar product. He too needed to engage in it, although he felt great sympathy for playing that kind of thing. They also, and not always, but may be provoking the target government. So, for instance, Umarov may have made all these threats so that he knew that the Russians would have to come down with a heavy hand, and that may gain him a lot more recruits in the area. So, while there's nearly always a group. Sometimes we have lone actors, and we oftentimes hear that a terrorist is a lone wolf, and I'll tell you that's almost always not true. Richard Dorner, who terrorized the police, was a true lone wolf. He developed his own manifesto, and he went on a terrorist rampage to try to right what he thought was a political wrong. He thought that the LA Police Department had racism, and through assassinations and violence, he set out to correct it. We also had the Unabomber, who was a true lone wolf, making his own political ideology and acting alone. But I've run into people that claim to be acting on their own. For instance, there was a man in Gaza who made his own suicide vest, who activated on his own. His wife strapped it on him. They raised their own funds for it. She sold her jewelry. He strapped the bomb on him and went to explode himself. I should say I didn't interview him. I interviewed his sister-in-law because he was already dead. But in truth, he was highly influenced by Hamas. He only had the know-how and the idea of targeting from the group that he was influenced by. And he would have gone through Hamas, but his brother had already gone, so he couldn't. They'll only send one male from a family. Likewise, we heard the Tsarnaev brothers were lone wolves, but they were far from it. Tamerlan and his brother were on the internet. They were interacting with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They were talking with an ideologue that was killed by our drones. Tamerlan had been to Dagestan and rubbed shoulders with extremists, maybe not terrorists, there, and he picked up a lot of ideology, and he followed the cookbook that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula put up. So it wasn't something he dreamed up in his own mind and came to by himself. So there's few terrorists who rely and act truly on their own. Most often a group provides them with the ideology, the planning, the targeting, the funding, the technological and material support, recruitment, and helps them to execute the mission. So that's the first element, the group. Second is the ideology. Individuals who attack innocent civilians have to be convinced that to do so is justified. In my view, there's no cause that ever justifies killing innocent civilians to advance that cause. There's just nothing political that justifies killing innocent civilians. But terrorists argue that's not so, that their cause is so important, so sacred, their land, their people are so sacred that you can attack civilians. And then, of course, that becomes particularly potent if they mix it with a religious ideology. If they take already existing scriptures that are widely held, and they claim that Allah or God ordains it, and then they claim that they're in a cosmic battle, and the great need justifies extreme measures. And we see this in various groups. I mean, many people tell me or ask me, isn't there something about Islam that causes terrorism? And my answer to that is no. There's something about terrorism and terrorist groups and their ideology that uses already existing religions and can hijack them if they have any scriptures whatsoever that condone violence. So we see Al-Qaeda and related militant jihadi groups using Islamic scriptures to justify engaging in terrorism. But we've also seen groups like the Army of God. That was a group that was active here in the U.S. with abortion clinic terrorism, and I was on the defense case for one of these abortion clinic terrorists. She'd been heavily influenced by a book, and I read the entire book. It's not quite as big as mine, but a big book called The Army of God, and it relies completely on Christian scriptures and Old Testament scriptures that say, smite the evildoer. And these scriptures were twisted to justify assassinating abortion clinic doctors or bombing abortion clinics. So it really doesn't matter as long as people resonate to those scriptures and you can somehow make a leap over to the terrorist cause. So the important thing that we need to understand about ideology is that it has to ring true for the individual, and if you use their religion, that's a good way to do it. It also has to offer to meet some inner needs of that person. It has to be something that he resonates to and he's drawn to. It should confer meaning. It should help to define his reality and offer an acceptable response to current life circumstances. And an ideology has no power unless it somehow resonates with that individual and draws him in. So we have the group, the ideology. The third is social support. And that's made up of the constituents and sympathizers for the terrorist group. Social support determines the potential pool of recruits and their funding, and really whether they can exist or not. And researchers in the West Bank have found that social support for terrorism waxes and wanes according to how under threat the population itself feels. So if the population feels deeply under threat, if they're experiencing a lot of violence themselves, they'll be much more likely to endorse terrorism and support terrorist groups. If they feel that things are peaceful and hope for other means, they'll be less likely to endorse terrorist groups. And think about it, in a conflict zone, when a community member or a family member is violently killed, people just see the death. They see the violence. They don't see the nuances of the situation. So when I do show slides, I have this picture of down in Rafah on the Egyptian and Gaza border, a man holding a child and just horrible grief on his face and screaming, and all the people around him just screaming with grief and trauma that this child has been killed. And I am sure that none of them are thinking, yeah, we were tunneling underneath the border and getting missiles that we used to attack Israel, and Israel took a defensive action and decided to take that tunnel out, and this kid got hit in the crossfire. And they don't think like that. They think, you killed our child. So suddenly there's higher social support for, we have the right to kill their children too. So, and I should also mention with social support, we also have something called the looking glass phenomena. All of us look around at each other and think what's appropriate behavior. And we particularly look to our elders and our peers. But I also have another picture that I sometimes show of a granny in Gaza with a RPG launcher on her shoulder. And I think, if your granny is engaging in it, you think it's fine, right? I mean, whatever granny does is probably okay for most people. And so we can find that social support can be nearly 100%. So if you go into a place like West Bank or Gaza, you see posters everywhere. People that engage in terrorism expect to have a martyr video. They make martyr video. They expect it to show up on the TV. They may have a song written and sung about them. They'll be highly glorified. They expect that nearly their entire population will support their action. And that's quite different than if you think of Tamerlan Tsarnaev sitting in Boston. Maybe he's got a few people in an extremist mosque that he feels will support him. Maybe he feels the people back in Dagestan will support him. Maybe he's getting his social support through the internet and feeling that he'll be supported and glorified over the airwaves, which he was. But it's a different phenomena. So social support is really important in how the person decides to take on this identity and to engage or not. Let's see. So the last element in the lethal cocktail of terrorism is the individual. And that's really where I drilled down deep. I looked at what are the vulnerabilities, what are the motivations for this person to engage with the group, why does he or she resonate to the ideology, and how do they interact with the social support that's surrounding that. And I found that I could break this into two very distinct categories. There was conflict zone vulnerabilities and motivations, and non-conflict zone motivations and vulnerabilities. In a conflict zone, the enemy is clearly identified and often easily demonized. There's generally a great deal of post-traumatic stress. If you look in any conflict zone, you find rates usually above 50% for post-traumatic symptoms, and sometimes for the full-blown PTSD. Sometimes you can find them up to 80%. There's traumatic bereavement. There's a feeling of survival guilt, a sense of a foreshortened future, and for those that are traumatically bereaved, often a longing to rejoin deceased loved ones. So I'd like to tell you a few stories from conflict zones. When we went over to West Bank, we stayed in the homes of our guides and sometimes in the homes of terrorists. And on one of our trips, we had picked up a guide, a young girl, college girl, and she had helped us to meet Ahmed Sadat, the leader of the PFLP, and she'd taken us around, and we developed a pretty good trust with her. And at one of our trips, she said, "Come stay at my house." So we did, and she had a one room, so we just all stayed in her room. And I didn't have any feeling that she really was a militant. In fact, she just seemed, more like a normal college student. And but she showed us in her room, well, I guess it was two rooms, but it was big open space, that everywhere there were posters of her friends, of martyrs, with quotes. And she said, "These are my 5 best friends. They were all killed." And that's a bit disturbing, and you think she's seeing that every single day, looking at her friends that have been killed. None of them had self-suicided. They'd all been killed in skirmishes with the Israelis. And that night, after we'd had a meal and we'd done interviews, we went to bed, and she sat up in her bed and she started crying. And she said, "I just want my group to give me a gun." And her particular group didn't arm women. And she said, "I want them to give me a gun." And we all sat up and we were like, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "I just want to take a gun and I want to kill as many Israelis as I can." And I said, "Are you saying you want to be a suicide bomber?" And she said, "No, not a bomber, I want a gun." But there's really very little difference. And we said, "Well, Laura, don't you realize you would be, you'd maybe kill a few people, but you'd be killed too. And, is that something you'd really be willing to do?" And she was just crying, and she said, "Didn't you see my room? Didn't you see all these posters? Everyone's dead. Why should I stay alive?" And we talked to her and calmed her down and, got her back into a different state. But, this is someone with traumatic bereavement. And in her case, we were greatly relieved to know that her group wouldn't arm her, so we didn't have to worry that much. But in the same vein, we also went into the prisons on one of these trips, and I met Erin Ahmed. I think she's now been released. But Erin was similarly a college student. She'd been in Bethlehem, and she was dating a guy that was a militant. And Erin wasn't involved at all, as far as if she was telling the truth. And she said she was going to school. She was planning to get her master's in business. She wanted to move to Dubai. And one day, her fiancé was killed. From her point of view, she said it was an Israeli rocket. My Israeli guide in that situation, I went in with an Israeli Yoram Schweitzer. He told me no, their intelligence was that he had blown himself up in his car. But there were many targeted assassinations at that time, and the Palestinians claimed it was a targeted assassination. So from her point of view, he was assassinated. And she immediately changed her clothing. So she went from dressing like a Western woman to putting on a abaya and a hijab. And she went to Hamas and she said, "Give me a bomb. I'm like to go and avenge his death." So in a short time, they armed her with a bomb. They made their plan, and they picked her up. They told her what was going to happen. And she went with another young boy, and she recalled that while she was in the car, it was quite upsetting to be with this young boy because she felt like, "You're going to kill yourself? You're too young. Do you know what you're doing?" And the idea was that the boy was supposed to explode himself first, and Erin was to go next, and but she was to wait until there was a crowd gathered. And they got off. They walked around. They were near Tel Aviv. That was their target area. And the young boy exploded himself. And Erin was walking around, and she said she suddenly got an insight. She saw a baby in a stroller, and she said, Allah gives life, and Allah takes life. I don't have the right to do this. So she called her senders, and she said, come and pick me up. And there was a big argument, but contrary to popular belief, I think there's a researcher, Ariel Morari, that says you can't turn back. You can, and I've talked to lots of people that have verified that for me, among the Palestinians at least. So they came and picked her up, and she was later arrested, and I was meeting her in prison. And it was quite some time at this point, but she said she felt that the group had really cynically taken advantage of her traumatic bereavement. But she also said at that time she was very willing to die, that she just wanted to die, go to paradise, and be with her fiancé. She felt her entire life she had this sense of foreshortened future, which is what we see with PTSD. That she felt her entire life was ruined. There was nothing to live for, and she'd be better off dead. So if she was going to die, why not take out some of the enemy along with? But then she did come to her senses and decide that attacking at least infants wasn't correct. So she would be somebody that we would talk about having extreme psych ache. We find when we look at normal suicides here, and with our Chechens, well, with many of these people, the accomplished suicide bombers, we would do what we called psychological autopsies. So we would look at what put this person on the terrorist trajectory. Just like when you look at a suicide and you do a psychological autopsy here in the States, you look at how did this person get to the point that they jumped out the window, kicked the chair, whatever they did. And in most cases, when researchers here in the States look at it, they almost always find that the most determining variable is a high degree of what they call psych ache, that you're just in so much pain you just want to leave life. And that's how Erin felt. She also was offered an honorable exit. She couldn't suicide in her society. That wouldn't have been acceptable. And she was offered a short-term fix for traumatic bereavement. In the same interview, or in the same day, we interviewed a young woman named Amaya Damaj. Amaya had also been planning to be a suicide bomber. She didn't actually carry her bomb as Erin did, and she was in prison. And the Israeli partner that I was with, Yoram Schweitzer, expressed complete disbelief when Amaya told us she had decided to volunteer herself, and she would have been the first female bomber, but her mission was delayed. And she had decided to volunteer herself because she saw on television what had happened in Jenin. And Jenin had been surrounded by the Israeli Defense Force, and there were skirmishes, and the terrorist groups there had asked their wives, do you want to stay with us? And in a sense, they functioned as human shields, put the Israelis in a really bad spot. And when they did have their fight out, women and children were killed. And she had seen this, and there was especially a little girl that she had seen on TV. And she talked about as though she had seen it with her own eyes. So I had to ask her to clarify, did you see this yourself? Because she was from Jenin. Or did you hear about this? And she said, oh, I saw it on television. But it felt to her like she had seen it with her own eyes. And she went and volunteered herself because she was so upset by it. And she wanted to revenge for this little girl, and she waited for 40 days for her bomb. And Yoram couldn't believe it. He was like, there's no way that somebody can think any day out of 40 days, somebody's going to come and hand me a bomb, I'm going to strap it on, I'm going to explode myself. You couldn't have stayed in that psychological state of readiness. And she said, no, I did. And for me, it verified what I was already starting to find, that people that go on suicide missions are very similar to people that suicide under normal circumstances. When researchers look at their videotapes and their audio tapes that they leave behind, and many normal suiciders do audio and videotape themselves, in their last moments they go dissociative. They just blank out part of their emotional processing, even some of their thought process, it just drops out, and they become very emotionally numb, and then they are able to carry out their act. And it's probably a psychological defense mechanism. What we don't know from normal suicides, because they're not here to tell us afterwards, is that they might also have felt an extreme sense of euphoria. And the suicide bombers do tell us that, the failed ones. And Amaya was one of these people. And she said, it was a holy time for me. I felt that I was in a holy state. And actually, while I was interviewing her, she became giddy and drunk. So I turned to Aaron had agreed to interpret for this interview because Yoram was doing the interviews in Hebrew, and I didn't feel good about that. I wanted to do it in Arabic. So since Aaron's English was so good, we'd asked her to stay and interpret. And I asked the girl, you're acting a bit giddy and drunk. Did you, during that time, drink anything, or did you have sex? And we'd been talking to her for quite a long time, and I had a good rapport. And Aaron said, I won't ask her that question. That's a really disrespectful question. And I said, no, Aaron, I'm really trying to get at something, and I already had Aaron's trust, too, because of the previous interview. And I'm not meaning to insult her, but please ask her, because it's really important. And the girl's eyes got big, and she's like, no, I never drank, I never had sex, and she was quite young. And I said, well, do you realize that you're acting right here now as though you're drunk and you're on a drug? And she said, yeah, I feel it. And this is exactly how I felt when I was waiting for my bomb. I would look at my parents and I would say in my mind, goodbye, and I just felt euphoric. And it was interesting to me because I said, I explored it quite a bit, and I said, if we have time, I will try to show you how to go back into the state if you want, because she had a long time to spend in prison. And Aaron said, show me too. But Aaron hadn't done that. And I became so interested in that phenomena that we also, back in Belgium where I was living at the time, did a thought experiment with normal students. So we had about 25 students of different nationalities, a lot of them that knew hardly anything about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And we asked them to come into a room, and we screened them for any suicidality or mental health kind of issues. And we asked them, would you be willing to be in a role play? It's kind of a crazy one. You'd pretend you're a Palestinian and you were going to be a suicide bomber, but you weren't able to carry out your mission. You're in prison and we want to interview you. And they looked at me like, you're crazy, but sure. And so we took a little time of setting it up to put them in role. And then we told them basic instructions that we wanted to look at this thing about television. We said there were 2 kids that were killed by an Israeli soldier, and you saw it on television, and that's the thing that pushed you over the edge. There may be other reasons, but that's the thing that pushed you over the edge. You yourself volunteered, because that's what was happening during the Second Intifada. You were given a bomb, but you were allowed to pick your own target. And so those were the basic instructions. And then, we asked them, how are you doing in prison? Do you have contact with your family? And suddenly a lot of these people would produce these 2 boys that had been killed as family members, which we took as an indication of fictive kin, that they really related to what they saw on television, they now incorporated into their story, and which we actually heard from terrorists as well. And but the really amazing thing was that when we finally got to the point of, asking them our whole history, we asked them, well, what did you pick as your target? You were allowed to pick your own target. What did you pick? And some would say a school, and they'd say really horrible things like they're killing our kids so we can kill theirs. Or some would say, well, I only wanted to blow up soldiers. And these are normal college students, I think. And anyway, when they got to the point of, okay, they gave you your bomb belt and you strapped it on. Do you remember how that felt? And they're just producing this in imagination. And over half of them said, I felt euphoric. I felt like I was floating up above my body. I felt so powerful. And I thought, geez, that's got to be a psychological defense. If we can induce it in 45 minutes in a thought experiment, it must be that all of us maybe move to that numb state and maybe even kick in our endorphin system to think about killing ourselves in that horrific way, and then also killing other people. But anyway, Amaya described that in detail. And I also had people in Gaza tell me about that. The earlier woman that I told you about, her brother-in-law had strapped on his own bomb. Her husband had also gone as a bomber, and she said the night before he came home, he was very euphoric. He was dancing, he was playing with the children, and she thought he was just very uncharacteristically happy, especially given their circumstances at the time in Gaza. So, another person that I interviewed, I guess I picked a lot of examples from the West Bank, but they're similar in other places. I just happened to pick these, is Zacharias Zubeidi. He's from the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in Jenin. He's a terrorist leader. And he was being targeted for assassination by the Israelis at the time I spoke with him. And I went into a small room with him and his cadres. He had an automatic rifle on his lap while he talked to me, and all his militant partners had their guns, and they were standing at the windows and the doors looking for the Israelis to come at any moment. And it was a tough interview, and I didn't do so well with him in the beginning. And a lucky thing happened for me, and lucky in two ways, because the next thing that I expected didn't happen. But I had turned off my phone when I started the interview with him, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, if the Mossad wants your interview, they need to come get it themselves, because, you know, a phone can be a listening device." And he kind of rolled his eyes at that. And I started the interview, and I was trying to understand how he thinks, and just wasn't getting any rapport, and I could tell he was kind of disgusted, didn't like me. And suddenly his phone rang, and I'm sure you know that the Israelis and other militaries can target you. That, you know, they can triangulate on your phone and, you know, through voice recognition, figure out it is indeed you, and then they can, you know, decide to attack. And he picked up his phone and he said, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" And I thought, oh, crap. And and I have a lot of counterterrorism friends and been to a lot of counterterrorism conferences in Israel. So they had told me they can target within 14 centimeters. And that just ran through my mind. And I thought, yeah, sitting too close. And and I thought about backing up, but I kind of make up my mind when I go into these situations. You know, you're in it, and you know, you just have to trust your fate at that moment. So I didn't back up. And he slammed his phone down and turned it off and threw it on the table. And then he looked at me and he's like, "Oh, you didn't react. You didn't, you know, you didn't back up your chair. You didn't anything." And I suddenly had him. And then I asked him, "You have all these young kids coming to you volunteering to be suicide terrorists. What's their psychological profile? What do they look like? What's going on with them?" And he at first started to tell me that they're martyrs. They're like saints. Nobody can describe them. It's not psychological. And then he threw at me, "Well, tell me, how does the person look that's standing on the top of a building when he's about to jump off? How does he look? And what's his psychological profile?" And I said, "Aha, I can tell you. He's in a dissociated state." And I explained the concept, and I said, "You know, you're living in a conflict zone. Maybe you have people that have PTSD, and with PTSD, you very easily go into a dissociative state instead of going, well, when you go into a flashback and also when you're fighting a flashback." And then he got completely engrossed, and he said, "I have that. That happens to me." And he said, "Let me tell you about when the Israelis were coming after me." He said, "I was in a small building, and the Israelis were coming after him, and he had his gun, and he knew that he was going to be killed. He was surrounded. And he said, I thought, I'll open the door, I'll shoot as many as I can, but I am now becoming a martyr." And he said, "I went into that place in my mind." And he said, "But as I opened the door, I changed, and I became a warrior. And so I moved out of it, and I ran out, and I shot as many as I could, and I ran like crazy, and he got shot in the leg, but he got away." And he said, martyrs are always in that dissociative state. He said when they come to him, they have such bad PTSD, because remember, he's operating in a conflict zone during the Second Intifada. They're always in a dissociative state. They can't move in and out of it. He said warriors move in and out of it. Then he also told me that he got a lot more girls volunteering than young men. And I said, "What's that about?" And he was kind of puzzled. You know, it was funny. He hadn't thought a lot about some of these things. And he said, "Probably I can't give them a gun to be a fighter. And so, you know, it's one of the only things that they can do." And but anyway, there's a lot more about him in my book. Another guy in Chechnya, so this is all conflict zone things, was going through the checkpoints, and he had put Osama Bin Laden's, do I need to wrap it up? Is it getting close? Okay. Sorry, I don't have a clock here. But he had okay, thank you. He had a picture of Osama Bin Laden in his passport, and in Grozny at the time, there were 17 checkpoints that you could conceivably pass through, and you could really be searched. And there was one woman that had told us that when she got pulled off a bus and she was searched at one of these checkpoints, she flipped into one of these dissociative states because she was so traumatized by the search process that she had gone up to a Russian soldier and grabbed his gun and put everybody else at gunpoint. So she'd flipped the situation. And she wasn't a militant, but she was just somebody with some trauma and suddenly flipped out. And luckily everybody calmed her down and said, you know, give the gun back, get on the bus. And but it always struck me as she's a really vulnerable person. You know, she was already in that place where someone could activate her. She's activating herself even. Well, this young boy also went through these checkpoints. His name was Omar. And his story, when we found out that he was moving with this passport that had Osama Bin Laden's picture, we're like, are you crazy? You're going to get killed. And he said, no, the Muslim Brothers are my protectors, and Osama bin Laden stood up to the United States, and he's standing up to Russia, and let them see it. So we looked into his history a bit, and it turned out in the first or the second war with Russia, there was carpet bombing, and his family had been huddled in a building, and somebody had to go get water. So his father ran out to get water, and he was hit by a mortar, and he lost his leg. But when he was first hit, he laid out in the courtyard, and no one had the courage to go and get him. So this boy, at around 10, 11, was watching this. And my father can't protect us. He's not invulnerable, as children hope that their parents are. And other people don't protect him. Then they had gone to the village, and in their village, some people had been caught by the Russians, and the Russians decided that their punishment would be that they would have bombs strapped to them, and they would explode them, and all their body parts, you know, would go everywhere. And they did this in front of the villagers as their punishment. And again, Omar saw that the villagers were afraid to pick up their body parts. They were afraid to do anything. They didn't stand up to the Russians, and you know, the Russians had guns, they didn't. And the last thing that had happened, they'd been hiding out in a building, and the soldiers were going from building to building, and they found their little group, and they pulled the men out. And so they pulled his father, who only had one leg at that point, and they pulled Omar out because he was beginning to look like a young man. And they put him up against the wall, and they said that they were going to shoot them. And instead of shooting them, they shot over their heads. But Omar went dissociative, and after, he turned to his father and he said, "Are we in paradise?" Because he thought he'd been killed. And when he kind of came to, he figured it out, and his conclusion was, the men here cannot protect me. So when the jihadis started setting up shop there, and there were little groups of militants, he resonated to their ideology. He resonated to them as protectors and men. He was a young adolescent, and they filled his needs. And luckily, my colleague and her sister intervened with him and got him pulled back out. So what we find in the conflict zones is that there's a high level of PTSD, and you do hear that terrorists are not mentally ill. And I would agree with that if you don't call PTSD mental illness. And terrorists don't want to deal with somebody that's unreliable, but they're very willing to deal with somebody that has PTSD, because that person is in a lot of pain, especially if they're in a conflict zone, and they can offer them an ideology that's basically offering them a short-term psychological fix. I'll put you in a euphoric state. I'll convince you that you're going to a better place. I'll offer you a heroic mission. I'll equip you for revenge, and boom, you'll take off. So that explains in conflict zones, basically trauma and revenge oriented. In non-conflict zones, it's a bit different. It's usually on the individual level, we see discrimination, marginalization, identity issues, search for meaning and significance, wanting to belong, a sense of wanting heroism. Sometimes there's poverty and despair. Sometimes there's a desire to escape. Sometimes there's also PTSD. And for young boys in non-conflict zones, we sometimes see issues related to manhood and the promise of girls in this life, not the virgins in the next life, but girls in this life. So let me give you a few examples. One guy I interviewed in Antwerp, his name was Hamid, and he started out by saying at age 17, I would have given my life for Osama Bin Laden. And his story started that he was a Moroccan second-generation immigrant. In Belgium, there's a lot of discrimination against the Moroccan ethnicity. And even though he had a Belgian passport, he found many times he couldn't get jobs, couldn't go to nightclubs, couldn't do the things that normal white Belgians do easily. And there had been riots in his community in Antwerp over, the police were known to be more Vlaams Blok, which is a kind of neo-Nazi thing. And there's a lot of anti-immigration politics in his town. And during this time period, he went to an internet cafe, and he was just reading his emails, playing games, that kind of thing. And the guy next to him said, hey, brother, have you seen the latest video? And he said, no. And so he, looked over at that guy's video, and it turned out it was a video showing all different places in the world, Palestine, Chechnya. I don't think Iraq was going yet then, but different places where the narrative of Muslims are under attack. The West is hurting Muslims. Women are getting terribly hurt. Children are getting terribly hurt. And it had a lot of music and Islamic scriptures in it. And it was very sad and very traumatic. And he said by the time he got to the end of the interview, he had tears in his eyes. The video, he had tears in his eyes. And he said, that guy knew I was putty in his hands. So the film ended with Osama Bin Laden showing up on it, saying, I'm fighting this, will you join me? So the guy turns to him and says, well, will you join? And Hamid had enough judgment to say, no, that's not for me. But then the guy said, well, in Belgium, we live uneasily among our neighbors, don't we? And that's really true. I lived in Belgium for 7 years, and I was amazed. I would sit outside of nightclubs, and I would watch Moroccans turned away. I saw a lot of discrimination, heard about it a lot. I even once asked the anti-discrimination minister, how does this go on? You have these laws in Europe that you can't discriminate, and how can Moroccans be routinely turned away at nightclubs? And he said, well, they cause all the problems. And I thought, you're the minister? And, I'm a white person asking him this, imagine otherwise. And there's not very many penalties for discrimination. So he said, we live uneasily among our neighbors. And Hamid had to agree that was true. And he said, brother, don't you remember what happened in the former Yugoslavia when suddenly neighbors that were living peacefully together but tensely, that suddenly they were raping our Muslim women? And he said, what if that happens here? Are you ready? Why don't you at least come to the gym and work out with us? So he got him. And Hamid started going to the gym and working out, and then it was like, why don't you come to our ideological group and learn a little bit more about Islam, although he was practicing. But this was learn about the militant jihadi version, which many argue isn't Islam. And he got deeply into it. He went into the forest in the Ardennes and practiced with guns. And one time he said they were having a drill with, brown on white or something like that. And they had gone up on top of a cabin, and they were shooting, they had BB guns. They were shooting at each other, and they didn't realize that there were inhabitants in this cabin. So the Belgian police showed up, and they had searchlights. It was in darkness. And these guys were all in their Salafi robes, and they climbed up in trees. So they were with guns and Salafi robes up in trees, but the police didn't think to look up, so they didn't find them, which always makes me laugh. But anyway, what I found over and over again in the non-conflict zones, that it was issues of not fitting in, of somehow being lost. So, for instance, I also talked to another young man in Belgium who was of Rwandan descent. He had been adopted. So he was a black boy living in a white family. He'd grown up with Christian European values. But when he was a teenager, he started looking for, who am I really? And so he gravitated to the Moroccan crowd and didn't really fit in. So then he wanted to prove himself even more. And somebody invited him into one of these groups that was militant jihadi. And he said, I had decided to convert to Islam, and then I wanted to go to the extreme because I really wanted to prove that I'm a Muslim. So he went to the extreme. And he said in Belgium, if you go down that path, if somebody comes and they're an Arabic speaker and you're not, anytime you have a question, they say, well, you know, you're reading the Quran in French, and let me tell you what it says in Arabic, so you don't quite have it right. And then he married more deeply into it, and sometimes we find terrorists in non-conflict zones getting into it by marriage and friendship ties. Mark Sageman's a band of guys. And he started watching Al-Manar TV, the Hezbollah channel, and seeing things that really disturbed him. And he went down the path that he said he almost volunteered to go on a mission and go down to Israel. And we've had guys from the UK do this, go down to Israel and try to kill as many as they could. And he said he was stopped at the last minute by a dream that he had. And from the way he explained it, I thought his dream really came from some internal stopping of the way he'd been raised, that he'd been raised with violence isn't an answer. So I also talked to someone that had worked with 17 kids in London, and these kids had all been from gangs. They were invited to go to an extremist camp and learn how to convert replica pistols into real pistols, to make explosives, and to basically join a splinter group of Al-Qaeda and raise money through criminal activities for Al-Qaeda. And the draw for them was they were mostly from single-parent families, sometimes no parents, and one parent was in prison. They were living in many conflict zones in London. If you cross postcodes, if you're a girl, you can get raped. It's not unusual for a bunch of boys to stop you and for there to be gang rapes. So the girls already were wearing baggy clothes that don't show their figures. And when they were taken to this training camp, and the leaders said, convert to Islam, join us, look, look at your lives, look at how many people among your age group are killed. Do you realize you're going to hell if you get killed? Join us. At least if you get killed, you'll be going to paradise. And if you join us, look, this is how we treat women. And you can't touch these girls. Put on a hijab and you can't touch these girls. And all of them found that if they joined, they suddenly could cross postcodes, because if they said salam alaikum and signaled that they were Muslim, it was okay to cross postcodes. So they got interested in it because there was a father figure for them. There was protection for them. There was a sense of belonging. There was a sense of mission. And the guy that was pulling him out of it surprised me because he was Shia. And I thought, if you're really ideologically convinced, you wouldn't even talk to a Shia. And he said the most difficult thing in talking them back out of it and pulling them out of it was replacing for them how strongly the person that had pulled them into it was functioning as a father figure. That they would easily give up the ideology. But they would say, don't rubbish our leader. I really cared about him. And so you see that there's different things that people are looking for in their lives. And if a group comes along with its ideology and offers it, I'll finish up, then that's what there is. So they asked me to talk about rebooting a terrorist. And that's the least that we know about. In Iraq, when I went in to reboot terrorists, we had 20,000 detainees. About 15% of them were ideologically convinced. And at that time, the existing programs, they were in Singapore, UK was just starting one, in Malaysia. I think there were about 15 programs around the world. And all of them relied only on Islamic challenge. And that was that an imam comes in the prison and talks to the people and tries to make friends with them and show them how their version of Islam is corrupt and their justification of terrorism is incorrect. And that works. You can talk people out of it. You can pull them out of it. And keep in mind that people that are highly ideologically convinced, one of the things that they hope is that in the end that they'll end up in paradise. So if you convince them, no, you're going to hell, that's pretty traumatic for them, especially if they've already engaged and murdered people. So in Iraq, we had a few people that got talked out of it through Islamic Challenge, but then, needed some help to kind of put themselves back together because they were really traumatized by that. They now had to make sense of who they were and the things that they had done. But what I did is I talked our military into adding a whole other prong to it, a psychological prong. And it relied 100% on going through all the things that I just told you, of looking at social support, looking at the individual vulnerabilities that existed and the hooks of where that ideology drew them in, if they had PTSD, treating their PTSD, and working very closely with the imam. So the psychologist and the imam would work together. And for me, that's the best model. There's claims that we had great success in Iraq. A lot of the politics were changing at the time I was there. We had mass releases, and I'm not so sure. I think that it was designed as a good program. I'm actually quite certain that it wasn't carried out as a good program. I didn't stay with it. And I'll just finish 2 more sentences. When we're looking at de-radicalization, which is what I was asked to do, there's 2 different things. There's, can you de-radicalize someone? Can you really change their ideological beliefs? Or can you simply disengage them from a group? And people spontaneously do both things. So we need to ask, why are they in the group to begin with, which is things I told you about, and what are the things that would stop them from leaving? Maybe there's threats to their lives if they stop, or to their families. Maybe they're married into it. It's a family thing. Maybe they have no other identity. Their whole self may be tied to the group. They may have walked into making a living through it. And so you have to look at these things and address them as well. And I'm a therapist, so I definitely believe that we can change people's thoughts and we can build their characters. Our Dr. Samanow told us that for the criminal mind, there's no rehabilitation, there's only habilitation. And in some cases, you do have to build a person. The things that they're missing, if they grew up in a conflict zone and all they've known is violence, you do have to build for them parts of their personality that were missing, like this young Omar. You have to show him there are people that can protect him other than these militants. But we definitely can change minds, and we can definitely disengage. So I'll leave you there and open to questions. Yeah.
Okay, how about right here, Amanda? Okay. Yeah, would you wait for the mic, please? Thank you.
Why does it appear to me, and anyway, I don't know how many notice it, that there are no old people who become suicide bombers or terrorists of other type? Why is it always young people? Because I think old people have depressions. They're not losing that much life. Why is it that they don't get involved in?
It's a good question, and we did find in the beginning when I was looking at this that we thought it was all 18-year-olds, and we found that there were more and more up to the age of 30, and there have been some suicide terrorists 50 and 60s, but they're much more younger people. And my guess would be they don't have attachments yet, life responsibilities. I hope that we gain wisdom as we age and get used to life's hard knocks and figure out ways. Yeah, I mean, if you got that far, you probably learned some ways to succeed.
But there are old people. There are so many old people who are supporters or who actually govern these.
Right.
So
Well, it's also our culture that we send our young to fight our battles. But among the Chechens, they believe that you should be married and have a child already before you go as a suicide bomber. So it's terrorism is very contextual, and then the group would take care of your children. So it's not all young people, but it's a good question, and I don't have a definitive answer.
Okay, about right here.
I'm just wondering how important, the afterlife, going to heaven, the 94 virgins is to these people. And, you know, why also do they think killing people will mean they would go to heaven?
Okay, well, their ideology, if they're following militant jihadi ideology, promises them that. And what I found was really, really important. It was really important that I'm going to escape the pain I'm in now, and I'm immediately, without any delay, going to paradise, because that's what they're told. And I'll be happy there, and I'll be safe there. But even more important was that I'll reunite with whoever I lost. And equally important was I'm not abandoning my family, because they're promised, I think it's 70 relatives that will also enter paradise with them when they die immediately. Because in Islam, you're measured, whether you're worthy to enter paradise. But if you're a martyr, you're worthy, you go in. So you can bring your 70 family members. So it's a sense of, I walked away from them, I'm no longer a provider, maybe their house is going to be destroyed, but I have this insurance policy on 70 of them. I didn't find anybody interested in the virgins, not at all. It just wasn't in their radar. I think it's something the West likes to write about.
But why killing, you know, civilians, innocent people, mean they would go to heaven? Why do they think that?
Well, they get into this thing of, you killed our civilians, so we don't have F-16, so the only way we can retaliate is with a suicide bomber, and if you're too heavily guarded, almost always they'll say, not always, but almost always, they'll say our first choice is to kill military and through a suicide bombing. But if that doesn't get your attention and stop you, or if you're too heavily fortified, we'll kill your civilians, and we won't feel bad about it because you're killing our civilians. Basayev, when he took Beslan, he was interviewed by Radio Liberty, and the guy asked him, you know, come on, you don't call yourself a terrorist, you just took 1,300 women and children. And he said, okay, call me a terrorist. The Russians killed 40,000 of our children. And that was his rationalization process. And it's wrong, but you can see 40,000 children, that's quite a few children, you know, that somebody would be upset and maybe start to lose some of their reasoning powers.
Okay, right there, Amanda.
I recently read a theory that at the basis of all violence, or certainly most violence, is a sense of powerlessness. Mm-hmm. And as I hear you speak, you seem to support that. Would you comment on that, please?
It's a good explanation. I don't ever think it's only one thing. So powerlessness, yes. There's one researcher that gave me a big, terrible time, and he said, all of these people have been child abused. And I talked to my Chechen colleague who was doing the interviews on the ground in Chechnya about that, and she said, let this guy, I'm not going to name him, let him come to Chechnya and see the destruction that's happened in our lives. And it's not, and she was not an endorser of terrorism at all. It doesn't have to be child abuse that puts you on a path to wanting to retaliate with violence. Other people, like Jessica Stern, wrote about humiliation. And I would say it's multifactorial, but certainly powerlessness is not a good way to feel. And if a group comes and promises to empower you, and you're feeling angry and hurt and upset, it's empowering.
Right here.
Do you have any comments in regard to the release of those prisoners who are in Iraq at this point?
I think in Iraq, we were dealing with a lot of people that got picked up in sweeps, and the real high-value ones probably got transferred elsewhere, or they were in a certain block, and I don't think that they were released. I didn't stay with the program, but the releases ended up being less about that they had successfully gone through a program and more about, we've decided you don't look like a threat to us, and we'd like to have good relations with your tribe, so we'll let 5,000 go from this area or that area. And it seemed to work. There was some recidivism, and the statistics that came out showed a low level. Some people have argued with that. But, we can widen that and look at Gitmo. We have people that have engaged in terrorism after Gitmo, but they're not getting any rehabilitation program there. In fact, they're probably getting the opposite. So,
Right here.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. What do you think the motivation was, or what was the motivation of these people who spoke with you?
I asked myself a lot, why did they trust me? And I did clinical for over 20 years, so I'm pretty good at getting people to talk about painful things in their lives. And in the West Bank and Gaza, I traveled with 2 young guys, and we really loved each other. They had their own traumas, and they'd talk to me about it, and we were just mutually supportive of each other. So I think they saw kind of a mother-son relationship, which fit their cultural views. But definitely there was the motivation to spread a message, to tell propaganda. And I sat and listened to it. I would sit and listen, for half an hour of blah, blah, blah propaganda until they said something personal. And then I would say, let's talk about that. And most of the people really got engaged in that. And I think in Islamic cultures particularly, men can't sit with women freely and talk. They don't have access to psychologists. I mean, just think even in our culture, if you got the chance to sit down with a psychologist that was totally locked on you, non-judgmental, and said, tell me about your life, and, oh, does this relate to that? No, it's not that, it's this. And they were kind of hooked on themselves.
Can you tell me how you went from 20 years of clinical therapy to interviewing terrorists?
My husband dragged me overseas, and I remember telling him, you're going to ruin our lives. And so he made U.S. ambassador. We went overseas, and I redefined myself. In Belarus, I did Holocaust interviews, and in Belgium, I meant to go help the hostages in Russia, because we were Russian-speaking. We'd served in Belarus. And we got into helping the hostages, and we were like, oh my God, they interviewed the terrorists themselves. And then this one student that I referenced traveling with the 2 students, I was teaching him in Belgium, and he'd been in a terror attack, and he kept saying, why don't we study the Palestinians? He'd been in Hebrew U when the cafeteria blew up. So he talked me into going through the West Bank and Gaza. And once I really got into it, I couldn't stop. It was like an addiction. It was so fascinating. And I should say my book is really big and thick, but it's filled with stories. It's even the stories of these students, and some of it's hilarious, and it's not a hard read. I wrote it for a regular lay audience, so it's not hard to understand at all.
And you'll be signing that book today, won't you, back
yes,
there?
I will, if you want me to.
Thank you for your lecture today.
You're welcome.
I have, you had mentioned the a previous lecture a couple times, a criminal mind, in your talk, and I have my really 2-part question. One is, first is, you've implied that you don't necessarily have to have a criminal mind to become a terrorist. I mean, that's the implication. And secondly, does having a criminal mind mean, is that where the leaders come from? I mean, does that fit in to the context of your discussion?
Well, I'm reading one of the previous author's books, and I disagreed with him on some aspects. I mean, I'm trained as a systems thinker, so I look at an individual embedded in a family, embedded in a community, embedded in a social system and a political system. And, errors in thinking can be society-wide. And I think he was describing a lot of really psychopathic behavior. And no, a lot of terrorists are very passionate people. They have a set of values. They follow them very clearly. And, they can talk about the people they're willing to kill and the people they're not willing to kill. I mean, a lot like soldiers do. And so I don't know, I don't want to use his concepts and say yes or no, because I'm not sure that I buy into them or even understand them completely. But I didn't find these people to be cold-hearted, horrible people in their totality.
It was never a requirement that you had to agree with all the other speakers. You understand that? Okay. All right, any other questions? One right here. Why don't we make the last one?
Well, you have talked mostly about the Muslims and the terrorists, and I think that there are other regions where there is terrorism that doesn't have nothing to do with religion, and I think that sometimes the terrorism is like a way to fight a war that is not, you don't have any other means to fight. I mean, I'm not justifying it, but it's just like, I think that for some people it doesn't have to be a religious motive, but perhaps it's a way to give meaning to their life, that kind of I mean, the only way they find to be able to fight there or to give away to their ideology or the thing that they would like to prove right.
Right, and in that sense, it's a good comment. In that sense, I think if we use the previous author, we could say there's the error in thinking, that your cause justifies killing innocent civilians. And I would say that's always wrong. But a terrorist would say, well, in this set of circumstances, it's correct because our oppression or what's happening is so terribly wrong that we have the right to fight back, and it gives us significance and meaning under our oppression. And I guess that would give them the criminal mind, wouldn't it? So,
Dr. Speckhard, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful experiences with us.